The dawn was breaking over the Valley of Mexico, and the surface of Lake Texcoco shimmered like a sheet of polished obsidian. In the heart of this vast lake, a small island bustled with life, a place that would soon become one of the most extraordinary cities the world had ever seen. But before the towering temples and bustling marketplaces, there was a journey, a prophecy, and a people who refused to be forgotten. A people in search of home. The Aztecs, or Mexica as they called themselves, were not always the lords of central Mexico. They began as nomadic tribes, wandering the arid landscapes of northern Mexico, driven by the whispers of their god, Quetzalcoatl, the deity of the sun and war. According to legend, they were destined to settle in the place where they would see an eagle perched on a cactus, devouring a serpent. This vision, sacred and mysterious, became their guiding star. For decades, the Mexico wandered, offering their service as mercenaries to stronger city-states, enduring humiliation and hardship. They were dismissed as uncivilized, their language mocked, their customs scorned. Yet within their hearts burned an unyielding belief. Their God had chosen them for greatness. The prophecy fulfilled around the year 1325. Their long journey ended. On a swampy island in Lake Texcoco, the vision appeared. The eagle, the cactus, the serpent, exactly as foretold. Here, in a place that seemed unfit for human habitation, they began to build. At first, the settlement was nothing more than reed huts and muddy paths, but the Mexica possessed two things that would change their fate forever: ingenuity and the will to survive. They invented chinampas, floating gardens made from mud, reeds, and lake sediment, anchored to the shallow lake bed. These fertile plots produced maize, beans, squash, and chili peppers in abundance, turning the marsh into a breadbasket. The Mexica's mastery of agriculture not only fed their people, but also allowed the city to expand rapidly. The first temples, as the population grew, so did the city's ambition. Wooden huts gave way to stone structures. The first temples were raised to honor Quetzalcoatl and Tlaloc, the rain god. Religious festivals filled the city with color and music, drums, flutes, and conch shells echoing across the water. The Aztecs believed that the sun required nourishment in the form of human blood, and even in these early days, captives from small skirmishes were offered as sacrifices to keep the cosmic balance. These rituals, shocking to outsiders, were sacred duties to the Mexica. Life and death, creation and destruction, were intertwined. Every drop of blood spilled was a promise to the gods that the world would continue turning. The web of alliances. The Aztecs knew they could not thrive alone. They began forming alliances with nearby city-states, trading goods such as cacao beans, obsidian blades, and brightly woven textiles. Slowly, they wove themselves into the political tapestry of the Valley of Mexico. Their reputation as fierce warriors grew, and rival kingdoms began to take notice. One pivotal moment came when the Mexica allied with Culhuacan, a powerful city-state. This alliance, though fragile, allowed them to strengthen their military and cultural influence. Yet politics in Mesoamerica was a dangerous game. Alliances could turn to enmities overnight. The birth of a rising power, by the late 14th century, was no longer a humble settlement. Its network of canals, caused but with power came inevitable conflict. The Aztecs' growing dominance stirred jealousy and fear among their neighbors. Whispers of war began to ripple across the valley. The stage was set for a dramatic rise story of conquest, glory, and tragedy that would echo for centuries. The early 15th century was a turning point in the Valley of Mexico. Though growing rapidly, still lived in the shadow of a greater power, Azcapotzalco, the capital of the Tepanec Empire. For decades, the Mexica had been Tepanec vassals, paying heavy tribute in maize, cotton, cacao, and even warriors for Tepanec campaigns. Their independence was little more than a dream whispered in the corridors of the palace. But dreams have a way of becoming dangerous when they are shared by a determined people. The tyranny of Azcapotzalco, the Tepanec king Maxla, ruled with greed and suspicion. He raised tributes to unbearable levels and openly insulted the Mexican nobility. The tension came to a breaking point when Maxla ordered the assassination of Quetzalcoatl, the young ruler, of who had tried to maintain peace. The streets fell silent in grief, but beneath the mourning lay a simmering fury. The Mexica Council gathered in secret, their voices hushed but resolute. The Tepanec yoke must be broken, an alliance in the shadows. War against Azcapotzalco would require allies. The Mexica turned to the exiled prince of Texcoco, whose own father had been killed by Maxla. was a poet and philosopher, but also a cunning strategist. Their fates aligned perfectly. Both had lost family to Tapanic treachery. Both hungered for revenge. To strengthen their cause, they approached Tlacopan, another city-state oppressed by the Tapanics. The three swore an oath beneath the moonlight, their hands joined over a bowl of sacrificial blood. This was the birth of the Triple Alliance, an unprecedented coalition that would shake the foundations of central Mexico. The War for Freedom. In 1428, the Allies struck canoes filled with Mexican warriors, sliced through the waters of Lake Texcoco. The drumming of war echoed from the hills, and the night sky burned with torches. Forces struck Azcapotzalco's heart, while the Mexica cut off their supply lines. The Tapanics fought fiercely, but the alliance's strategy and unity proved unstoppable. After months of siege, the walls of Azcapotzalco fell. Maxtla was captured, humiliated, and executed. The Tapanic Empire was no more. Dividing the spoils, victory brought power and decisions. The three members of the Triple Alliance agreed to divide the tribute from conquered territories, would receive 2/5, Texcoco 2/5, and Tlacopan 1/5. Though the division seemed fair, its location and military strength ensured its dominance would grow. Under the rule of its Quetzalcoatl, the Mexica began rewriting their history. Chroniclers destroyed old records that depicted them as mere wanderers and vassals, replacing them with a glorious narrative of divine destiny. History itself became a weapon. The age of expansion. With the Triple Alliance secured, the Aztecs turned outward. City after city fell under their influence, sometimes through the terror of war, other times through the subtlety of diplomacy. Tribute flowed into in staggering quantities: gold, silver, jade, cacao, exotic feathers, and rare animals. The city transformed. Stone causeways stretched across the lake, linking the island to the mainland. Massive temples rose higher, their steps stained with the blood of sacrifices. Markets bustled with merchants from distant lands, their goods filling the air with the scent of spices and the glimmer of precious stones. The shadow of ambition. But expansion came at a cost. Conquered peoples were forced to pay heavy tribute and send captives for sacrifice. Resentment grew like weeds beneath the glittering gardens of the Aztec war machine, fueled by a need for both tribute and sacrificial victims. Could not stop. Any pause might unravel the empire they had built. As the Triple Alliance tightened its grip on central Mexico, the Mexica began to believe they were invincible. Yet far beyond the Valley of Mexico, a new threat was already crossing the seas, one that would challenge everything they had created. The morning sun rose over Lake Texcoco, painting the waters in shades of gold and silver. From a distance seemed to float an island city of gleaming white temples, sprawling marketplaces, and vibrant gardens. Canals shimmered like ribbons of glass, and causeways stretched across the lake like the arms of a giant, connecting the city to the mainland. This was not merely a capital, it was the beating heart of an empire. A masterpiece of engineering by the mid-15th century, had grown into one of the largest cities in the world, rivaling the great capitals of Europe and Asia. Its population surged beyond 200,000, a staggering figure for the era. The city was a marvel of planning and architecture, divided into 4 grand districts, camping each with its own temples, schools, and markets. Stone causeways linked the city to the mainland in 3 directions, each wide enough for 10 warriors to march abreast. Bridges could be raised in times of war, turning the city into an island fortress. Beneath the streets, an intricate network of canals allowed canals to glide between neighborhoods, delivering goods from every corner of the empire. The genius of the Mexica shone brightest in the chinampas, floating gardens that expanded the arable land. These rectangular plots, formed from layers of mud, reeds, and lake sediment, yielded harvests so abundant that famine was almost unknown. Maize, beans, squash, tomatoes, and chili peppers fed the growing population, while flowers in every color adorned the gardens, filling the air with fragrance. The sacred center at the heart of stood the Templo Mayor, a massive double pyramid dedicated to Huitzilopochtli, god of the sun and war, and Tlaloc, god of rain and fertility. Its twin staircases rose steeply to the heavens, and from its summit, priests could see the entire city and the distant mountains. Ceremonies here were both awe-inspiring and terrifying. The Aztecs believed that the cosmos depended on the nourishment of the gods, nourishment that could only be provided by human blood. On festival days, thousands gathered in the plaza below to witness the sacrifices. the air thick with the scent of copal incense, the sound of drums pounding like the heartbeat of the earth. To the Mexica, these rituals were acts of devotion, ensuring the sun's rise and the rain's return. To outsiders, they were a reminder of the empire's unshakable power. Markets of wonder. Every day, the great market of Tlatelolco's twin city came alive with thousands of merchants and buyers. Goods from across Mesoamerica filled the stalls. Cacao beans from the tropical lowlands, obsidian blades from the highlands, jaguar pelts, turquoise mosaics, brilliant quetzal feathers, and pottery painted with scenes of gods and warriors. There was order amid the chaos. Judges oversaw the market, ensuring fairness in trade. Professional merchants, known as pochteka, acted as both traders and spies, bringing back intelligence from faraway lands, along with exotic goods. The schools of the empire was not only a center of commerce and religion, it was a city of learning. Children, regardless of class, were required to attend school. The sons of nobles studied in the Comicac, learning astronomy, history, law, and the sacred rituals. Commoners attended the Telpochcali, where they trained in warfare, farming, and crafts. Education was strict, discipline severe. The Mexica believed that a strong mind and body were both essential to serving the gods and the state. Life in the city, the streets bustled with life. Artisans shaped gold and silver into jewelry that glittered like sunlight on water. Women ground maize on stone slabs, filling the air with the scent of fresh tortillas. Children played in the courtyards, their laughter mingling with the calls of street vendors. At night, the city transformed. Torches lit the plazas, music drifted from the temples, and the reflection of the moon shimmered on the lake. From the top of the Templo Mayor, priests watched the stars, reading omens in their movements. An empire's pride by the late 15th century was the envy of Mesoamerica. Its wealth, beauty, and power seemed unmatched. Tribute flowed in from hundreds of conquered cities. The Mexica believed they were chosen by the gods to rule the world. But even as they celebrated their greatness, shadows began to form on the horizon. Conquered peoples whispered of rebellion, and far beyond the seas, sails of a different kind were catching the wind, bringing strangers who would see the city with both wonder and hunger. The late 15th century was an age of steel and obsidian, when the rulers were not just kings, they were warriors who carried the fate of the empire on their shoulders. From the towering steps of the Templo Mayor, they looked out over their domains and saw no limits. Every horizon was a battlefield waiting to be claimed. Quetzalcoatl, the first architect of empire, after the victory over Azcapotzalco and the birth of the Triple Alliance, Quetzalcoatl reshaped the destiny of the Mexica. He was more than a conqueror, he was a master of political power. Under his reign, 1427-1440, the Aztecs expanded into the fertile valleys and strategic trade routes around Lake Texcoco. Quetzalcoatl understood that control was not only won with armies but with memory. He ordered the destruction of ancient records that portrayed the Mexica as humble wanderers. In their place, new histories were written, filled with divine prophecies and tales of inevitable destiny. Through his reforms, the Aztecs did not just rule, they believed they had always been meant to rule. Moctezuma I, the builder and conqueror. Quetzalcoatl's successor Moctezuma I, 1442-1469, inherited a growing empire and transformed it into a superpower. His reign was marked by massive building projects, palaces, aqueducts that brought fresh spring water from the hills of Chapultepec. But Moctezuma I was also a relentless general. His armies swept into the Gulf Coast, subduing the Aztec and Totonac peoples. These conquests brought exotic goods to cacao, cotton, seashells, and jaguar pelts. The empire's tribute lists grew so long that officials needed entire warehouses to store the goods. Yet his victories came at a price. The conquered peoples were bound by fear, not loyalty. Tribute demands were heavy, and the flow of captives for sacrifice never ceased. Quetzalcoatl, the young eagle. In 1469, Quetzalcoatl ascended the throne at just 19 years old. His reign 1481 was one of bold ambition. He extended the empire westward, clashing with the powerful Tarascan state, and the campaign ended in disaster. The Tarascans repelled the Aztec forces with superior weapons and tactics, inflicting one of the few major defeats the Mexica ever suffered. But Quetzalcoatl recovered, launching successful campaigns elsewhere and overseeing the construction of the massive sunstone, a cosmic calendar that captured the Aztec vision of the universe. Tizak, the shadow of weakness, Quetzalcoatl's brother, Tizak 148-11486, was a different kind of ruler. His military campaigns were lackluster, earning him a reputation for weakness. Though the empire still expanded, the victories were small and the tribute light. For a people whose identity was built on conquest, Tizok's reign felt like a step backward. Rumors of conspiracy swirled. Some believed he was poisoned by his own nobles, paving the way for a far more formidable ruler. Quetzalcoatl, the ruthless jaguar, if Tizak was a shadow. Quetzalcoatl, 1486–1502, was a storm, a towering figure both in stature and ambition. He revitalized the Aztec war machine. His armies marched into Oaxaca, Chiapas, and the Pacific coast, adding vast territories to the empire. Quetzalcoatl's reign was marked by one of the most dramatic events in Aztec history, the rededication of the Templo Mayor in 1487. Chroniclers claim that over 20,000 captives were sacrificed during the ceremony, their blood flowing down the temple steps into the plaza below. Whether this number was exaggerated or not, the message was clear. Stood at the peak of its power, feared across Mesoamerica. He also expanded the city itself, building a new aqueduct and overseeing vast Chinampa developments. But his aggressive expansion strained the empire's resources, and resentment among subject peoples deepened. An empire on the edge. By 1502, the Aztec Empire spanned from the Gulf of Mexico to the Pacific Ocean. Its armies were unmatched, its capital unmatched in beauty and wealth. Yet, beneath the glittering surface, cracks began to appear. Rebellions simmered in the provinces, fueled by crushing tribute demands and the unending hunger for sacrificial victims. The empire had become a predator that could not stop hunting. Every victory fed its power, but also its dependence on conquest. And beyond the eastern horizon, winds were carrying strange ships bearing men in steel armor, riding beasts unknown to the Mexica, and bringing with them a fate the Aztecs could never have foreseen. The year was 1502. The empire stood at its zenith, its banners flying proudly from the Pacific coast to the shores of the Gulf of Mexico. In the great plaza of merchants from distant lands haggled over quetzal feathers, cacao beans, and gleaming obsidian blades. Yet within the palace walls, a new ruler took the throne, a man whose reign would be both magnificent and tragic. The rise of Moctezuma II, Moctezuma Xocoyotzin, known to history as Moctezuma II, was a tall, imposing figure with a regal bearing and a mind trained in both war and religion. Unlike some of his predecessors, he was deeply devout, a man who saw divine purpose in every act of governance. Moctezuma inherited an empire at its largest extent, but also at its most fragile. Rebellions simmered in the provinces, suppressed only by the iron hand of Aztec armies. To secure loyalty, Moctezuma relied on both diplomacy and fear. Tribute demands grew heavier, and ceremonial sacrifices became even grander, reinforcing the Mexica's image as the chosen people of the gods. The omens begin. It was in the early years of Moctezuma's reign that strange signs began to trouble the empire. The blazing comet. One night, a brilliant comet streaked across the sky, its tail burning white and red. Priests whispered that it was a sign of great change, perhaps even the end of the fifth sun, the age in which they lived. The burning temple. Without warning, the temple of Huitzilopochtli caught fire. Though the flames were extinguished, the stone walls cracked, and no earthly cause could be found. Lightning without rain. A lightning bolt struck the temple of Xiuhtecuhtli, the god of fire. Yet no storm clouds gathered, and no rain followed. The boiling lake. The waters of Lake Texcoco churned violently, flooding parts of the city as though an unseen hand had stirred the depths. The weeping woman. In the dead of night, citizens claimed to hear the cries of a woman drifting over the lake. "My children, we must flee. The end has come." Moctezuma's priests shuddered at the tale, for they believed it was a goddess who appeared before great disasters. Moctezuma's unease, the emperor's confidence began to waver. Moctezuma was not merely a warrior king. He was also the high priest of the empire, responsible for maintaining the balance between the gods and the mortal world. Every omen felt like a personal accusation, a sign that he had failed to appease the divine. He ordered more sacrifices, hoping to cleanse the empire of impending doom. Captives from recent campaigns were marched to the Templo Mayor, their hearts offered to the sun in a desperate bid to restore cosmic harmony. Whispers of strangers. Then came the rumors. Merchants traveling along the coast brought tales of giant canoe ships with towering white wings that moved without paddles. Upon these ships were pale-skinned men with hair like the color of the sun and eyes that gleamed like water. They rode beasts taller than any man and wore shells of shining stone that no obsidian blade could cut. At first, Moctezuma dismissed these as exaggerations or myths, yet deep inside, he remembered the prophecy of the god Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent who was said to one day return from the east to reclaim his throne. Could these strangers be his messengers? Or worse, could one of them be the god himself? The calm before the storm. As the years passed, the omens continued. Farmers reported hail in summer. Traders spoke of mountains rumbling far to the south. And on the horizon, unseen to the people, of sails were drawing ever closer, carried by the winds of fate. Moctezuma stood on the balcony of his palace, gazing over the glittering waters of Lake Texcoco. The city beneath him was a jewel unmatched in the known world, its temples reaching for the heavens. Yet in the depths of his heart, he felt a chilly sense that the gods were preparing to test the Mexica in ways they could not imagine. The age of conquest was ending. The age of survival was about to begin. The year was 1519. On the shores of the Gulf of Mexico, the calm morning air was broken by the sound of waves slapping against unfamiliar hulls. Fishermen along the coast of Veracruz shaded their eyes and froze in disbelief. Out on the horizon, enormous vessels approached floating fortresses with towering white wings that caught the wind and drove them forward without a single paddle stroke. These were the ships of, and with them came the storm that would forever change the fate of the Aztec Empire. The arrival of Cortés was a man of ambition that bordered on recklessness. A Spanish conquistador with little patience for hesitation, he had defied his governor's orders and set sail for the mainland in search of fortune, glory, and perhaps an empire to claim in the name of the Spanish crown. With him came about 500 soldiers, a handful of cannons, steel swords that flashed like lightning, muskets that roared like thunder, and most shocking of all, horses, towering beasts that seemed half man, half animal to the astonished locals. Upon landing, wasted no time establishing a foothold. He founded the settlement of Villarica de la Veracruz, not only to secure supplies, but also to sever ties with his former commander, symbolically burning his ships, so that retreat was no longer an option. First Contact, the Totonac people, long burdened by Aztec tribute demands, saw an opportunity in the newcomers. They greeted Cortés cautiously at first, but when they realized the Spaniards had powerful weapons and a desire to challenge, they became willing allies. Through them, learned of the vast city on the lake, ruled by a man named Moctezuma City, so rich that its palaces glittered with gold and turquoise. For, the decision was made, he would march inland. Moctezuma, ese dilemma. When word of the strangers reached Moctezuma's heart sank. Messengers described their white-skinned faces, their beards, their shining armor, and their terrifying beasts. They told of weapons that could kill from a distance with a single strike, and ships that could carry hundreds across the sea. The emperor summoned his council. Priests and nobles argued in hushed tones. Some insisted these were mere men who could be defeated. Others whispered that the prophecy of Quetzalcoatl's return had come true. Moctezuma, torn between fear and faith, decided on a strategy of caution. He would not confront these strangers outright. Instead, he sent envoys bearing rich gifts, gold, silver, and precious feathers, hoping to either appease them or convince them to turn back. The march inland, if Moctezuma hoped the gold would buy peace, he underestimated hunger. The treasures only confirmed his belief that this land was ripe for the taking. With Totonac allies and a growing number of native porters, began the long march toward the Valley of Mexico. Along the way, he encountered the fierce Tlaxcalans, traditional enemies of the Aztecs. After weeks of bloody battle, the Tlaxcalans, impressed by the Spaniards' resilience and firepower, agreed to join them. The alliance was a turning point. With the Tlaxcalans' knowledge of the terrain and warriors numbering in the thousands, S-Force transformed from a small expedition into a formidable army. The gift that sealed fate among the gifts Moctezuma had sent, too, was a golden disc as wide as a man's outstretched arms, shimmering like the sun itself. When Cortés presented it to his men, their eyes reflected the same greed that burned in his own. Gold was not just wealth to the Spaniards, it was power, the fuel for empire. And now, they knew exactly where to find more of it. The road to By autumn, and his army had crossed mountains and valleys. Their ranks swelled by indigenous allies who saw in the Spaniards a chance to break free from Aztec domination. Each step brought them closer to the shimmering city on the lake. Moctezuma, watching from his palace, wrestled with a decision that would determine the fate of his empire. Should he meet these strangers as honored guests, or as enemies to be destroyed before they reached his gates? The calm before the storm, the two worlds, one forged in obsidian and blood, the other in steel and gunpowder, were on a collision course. Neither fully understood the other, yet both believed themselves destined to triumph. As the causeways of lay in the distance, a meeting was inevitable, and when it came, it would be remembered for centuries not as a greeting of peace, but as the opening act of conquest. The morning mist drifted across the Valley of Mexico, clinging to the slopes of the surrounding mountains. Far below, the shimmering waters of Lake Texcoco reflected the white peaks of distant volcanoes. On the causeway leading to processions advanced toward each other, one from the island city, the other from the mainland. At their head walked Moctezuma II, dressed in a cloak of turquoise feathers and wearing a crown of gold encrusted with jade. Behind him came a retinue of nobles, priests, and warriors, their obsidian blades gleaming in the pale sunlight. From the opposite direction came, clad in polished steel armor, his helmet plumed, riding a warhorse that snorted clouds into the cool morning air. At his side marched Spanish soldiers and thousands of indigenous allies, Totonacs, Tlaxcolans bearing weapons and banners. It was a meeting that neither side would ever forget. The greeting as they drew near, the air grew tense. Moctezuma stopped, raising his hand. The emperor spoke through interpreters, first to Malintzin, Donna Marina, the Nahua woman who had become Esqui translator, then to De Aguilar, who carried her words into Spanish. Moctezuma welcomed too as an honored guest, but his words carried layers of meaning. Some chroniclers later claimed he spoke as if addressing a long-lost lord perhaps, even Quetzalcoatl himself returning to reclaim his throne. Ever the opportunist, did not deny it. The two men exchanged gifts. Moctezuma, presented with a necklace of golden crabs set with precious stones, offered a necklace of Venetian glass beads, which, though worthless to him, shone with exotic novelty to the Aztec courtiers. The first glimpse of the city from the causeway, the Spaniards beheld the full splendor of, for the first time. Whitewashed temples and palaces rose from the water, linked by a web of canals. Canoes glided silently beneath stone bridges, their paddlers steering with practiced grace. Gardens floated like green jewels on the lake's surface, and marketplaces teemed with color and sound. Bernal Diaz del Castillo, one of Cortes's soldiers, would later write that it was like the enchantments they tell of in the legend of Am, so magnificent that they doubted anything so grand could exist outside of dreams. Into the heart of the empire, Moctezuma led the Spaniards into the city, across wide streets where curious crowds gathered to watch the pale-skinned strangers and their terrifying beasts. They passed under the shadow of the Templo Mayor, its twin staircases climbing into the sky, the scent of copal incense drifting from its altars. At the imperial palace, Moctezuma lodged and his men in luxurious quarter-stone halls with carved doorways, soft reed mats, and gardens filled with exotic flowers. Servants brought trays of food, steaming tamales, roasted turkey, cacao drinks, spiced with chili and honey. Yet beneath the hospitality lay caution. Moctezuma assigned guards to watch the Spaniards, though he disguised them as attendants. He ordered that no one speak to the strangers without permission. Two minds at work was both awed and calculating. He marveled at the city's wealth, but also noted its vulnerabilities, the narrow causeways that could be cut, the reliance on lake water for transport, the political tensions simmering among subject peoples. Moctezuma, for his part, found himself caught between reverence, fear, and suspicion. He could not yet decide whether these men were God's envoys or conquerors, but one thing was certain: they had come with purpose, and that purpose was not to simply admire the city. An uneasy peace for days. The Spaniards explored, escorted by nobles. They visited the markets of Tlatelolco, where tens of thousands traded in an orderly maze of stalls. They toured the aviaries, zoos, and botanical gardens where jaguars paced in cages and tropical birds flashed like living rainbows. At night, the city glowed with torchlight, the sound of drums and flutes echoing from temple plazas. Yet every step the Spaniards took was watched. Every conversation was noted. The palace walls seemed to listen. The first seeds of conflict. As the days passed, hunger for gold became harder to disguise. He questioned Moctezuma endlessly about the empire's treasures, the tribute from conquered cities, and the location of gold mines. The emperor, wishing to maintain peace, offered gifts, but each gift only deepened Spanish greed. Meanwhile, among ES allies, whispers spread that Tlaxcalans urged him to strike quickly, warning that the Aztecs were masters of ambush and that Moctezuma's hospitality might only be a trap. The tension between courtesy and conquest grew with each passing day. It was clear to both king and conquistador that this fragile peace could not last forever. The storm approaches. In the heart of two worlds stood face to face, one bound by the gods, ritual, and centuries of tradition, the other driven by greed, ambition, and the steel of foreign empires. It was only a matter of time before one would try to master the other. And when that moment came, the canals of the Jewel on the lake would run red. The air in had shifted. What began as a cautious welcome was turning into something far darker. The Spanish soldiers, once honored guests, now moved through the streets with a confidence that felt almost like ownership. Their steel glinted in the sun, their horses clattered on the stone causeways, and their eyes lingered not just on the city's beauty, but on its treasures. Inside the imperial palace, Moctezuma II felt the weight of invisible chains woven not of metal, but of circumstance and fear. The spark, the event that set the trap in motion, began far from the city. In the coastal town of Nortla, under Aztec control, a Spanish garrison was attacked by the local governor, Cuauhtémoc. Acting under Moctezuma's authority, several Spaniards were killed. When news reached Hearn, on Court Us, he seized on it not as an insult, but as a weapon, accused Moctezuma of treachery, claiming the emperor had secretly ordered the assault. In truth, it's unclear whether Moctezuma had any direct involvement, but in S' mind, the time for subtlety was over. If the Aztec ruler could command his people to strike once, he could do so again, and Cortés could not afford to leave such power unchecked. The plan, gathering his captains, laid out his audacious plan. They would seize the emperor of the Aztec Empire, his own capital, surrounded by thousands of his warriors, and hold him hostage. With Moctezuma under Spanish control, the city itself would be shackled. It was a gamble bordering on madness, but Cortés understood the psychology of power. Control the leader, and you control the people. The confrontation on a cool morning, and a small group of armed men entered the royal palace under the pretense of a friendly visit. Moctezuma greeted them with the customary courtesy, unaware of their true intent, or perhaps aware, but too proud to show fear. Spoke through Melinson, laying the accusation of the Nortla attack before the emperor. Moctezuma denied giving the order, but pressed harder, his voice calm but edged with steel. The air in the chamber grew taut, as if the very walls were holding their breath. Then came the demand. Moctezuma must leave his palace and take up residence in the Spanish quarters, for his own safety. At first, the emperor was silent. Such a request was unthinkable. No ruler of the Mexica had ever been placed under the protection, let alone control, of foreigners. But the room was full of Spanish steel and the cold eyes of men ready to act. Moctezuma, calculating the bloodshed that would follow resistance, agreed. The walk of the emperor when Moctezuma emerged from the palace, flanked by Spanish soldiers, the people have stared in disbelief. There, Tlatoani, the great speaker, walked under the guard of strangers. Some believed it was a diplomatic gesture. Others saw it for what it was, an insult to the very heart of the empire. He was escorted across the plaza to the Spanish quarters, where he would remain under watch. The palace he entered was comfortable, but its walls were a prison. Guards stood at the entrances day and night. Couriers carried messages only with Spanish approval. Even his meals were monitored. The puppet king, from his gilded captivity, Moctezuma continued to issue commands, attend ceremonies, and greet envoys, but always under Spanish supervision. To the outside world, he was still emperor. Inside, he was a prisoner in his own city. Meanwhile, used Moctezuma's authority to his advantage, sending orders in the emperor's name to bring gold, tribute, and more captives. The flow of treasure grew, feeding the Spaniards' greed and cementing their hold. The growing fire among the Aztec nobles and warriors, anger smoldered. To see their ruler reduced to a shadow of his former power was an intolerable humiliation. Yet open revolt was dangerous. Moctezuma's own passivity seemed to bind their hands. But resentment has a way of boiling over. The city that once welcomed the Spaniards now watched them with narrowing eyes. and whispers of rebellion began to spread through the markets and temple courtyards, had gained the emperor. But in doing so, he had planted the seeds of a siege. The spring sun blazed over and the streets pulsed with anticipation. It was the time of Toxcatl, one of the most sacred festivals of the Aztec calendar, a month-long celebration honoring Tezcatlipoca, the god of fate, night, and sorcery. Even under the shadow of Spanish occupation, Moctezuma had insisted the festival proceed. To the emperor, the rituals were vital to keeping the gods appeased. To the people, they were a reminder of identity and tradition, even as foreign boots echoed in the palace halls. The sacred dance, the vast courtyard of the Templo Mayor filled with nobles, priests, and warriors dressed in brilliant feathered costumes. Drums thundered like the heartbeat of the earth, conch shells wailed, and dancers moved in perfect rhythm, their steps weaving a story as old as the empire itself. The Spaniards watched from the edges of the plaza. Many were impressed, some unnerved, but among them was Pedro de Alvarado, left in command by while the latter marched to the coast to face a rival Spanish expedition. Alvarado's eyes narrowed, suspicion growing with each beat of the drum. To him, the celebration looked less like worship and more like preparation for war. The warriors carried ceremonial weapons, obsidian-bladed macuahuitl, and spears that, in the right moment, could be turned against his men. The decision Alvarado's fear hardened into resolve. Whether driven by genuine belief in an imminent uprising, or by greed for the gold and jewels worn by the dancers, he gave the order. Spanish soldiers moved into position, their armor gleaming, swords unsheathed. The festival continued, unaware of the storm about to break. The massacre without warning, the Spaniards charged. The music choked into screams as steel crashed into unarmored flesh. Dancers fell where they stood, their bright feathers trampled into the blood-soaked ground. Obsidian blades shattered against Spanish shields. The few who resisted were cut down without mercy. Priests at the temple steps tried to flee, but musket fire cut them down. The sacred drums fell silent, toppled by the dead. Gold ornaments were torn from the bodies of nobles as soldiers looted even in the midst of killing. Eyewitness accounts later claimed that hundreds, perhaps thousands, were slaughtered that day in armed men, women, and children who had gathered to honor the gods. The roar of the city at first, shock held the city in stunned silence. Then the roar began. It rolled through the streets like thunder, echoing from the canals to the causeways. Warriors flooded into the plaza, their faces painted for war, obsidian blades glinting. Stones and spears rained down on the Spaniards, forcing them to retreat into the palace where Moctezuma was held. In an instant, the fragile peace was gone. The gates had closed and the Spaniards were trapped. The siege begins. Barricades rose in the streets. Canoes patrolled the canals, cutting off supplies. Every causeway became a killing ground, every alley a potential ambush. Spanish soldiers peered from the palace walls at an ocean of hostile faces. Inside, Moctezuma watched events spiral beyond his control. His people no longer saw him as their protector, but as a prisoner willing to bend to foreign will. His voice could no longer calm the storm. For the first time since setting foot in the city, the Spaniards felt fear not of the gods they mocked, but of the living empire that surrounded them. The massacre at Toxcatl had lit the fire. Now, the flames would consume everything. The air over was heavy with smoke and the stench of death. Since the massacre at Toxcatl, the city had been in open revolt. The Spaniards and their allies were barricaded inside the palace, cut off from food, water, and escape. Stones and spears rained down from rooftops day and night, while canoes swarmed the canals, making any movement deadly. In the palace courtyard, the once confident conquistadors now whispered in tense voices. Every day, their numbers dwindled, men dying from wounds, disease, or Aztec projectiles that struck with brutal precision. The death of Moctezuma, Moctezuma II, still a captive, was brought to the palace walls to speak to his people. Hoped the emperor could calm the rebellion, open the causeways, and allow the Spaniards to leave in peace. But the crowd that gathered below did not listen. Once Moctezuma had been the embodiment of divine authority. Now, they saw only a man who had surrendered their city to foreign invaders. Shouts of rage rose from the plaza. Stones flew. One struck Moctezuma in the head. The emperor fell, mortally wounded. Spanish accounts claim he died soon after in captivity. Aztec sources insist he was killed by the Spaniards themselves, when he ceased to be useful. Either way, the great speaker of the Mexica was gone with him any hope for peace. The plan to escape knew they could not hold the palace much longer. Supplies were nearly gone, and the city's warriors were relentless. The only option was to flee under cover of night, carrying as much treasure as they could. The Tlaxcalan allies were prepared, but fear haunted even their steps. Escaping meant crossing the narrow causeways that linked the city to the mainland. Causeways already damaged and guarded by Aztec warriors. The Spaniards built portable wooden bridges to span the gaps where the causeways had been cut. Every man was ordered to move in silence. No fires, no lights. The treasure was loaded into chests and sacks, though some soldiers, consumed by greed, stuffed gold into their armor, slowing their movements. The night of sorrows. In the dead of night, the gates of the palace opened. The procession moved like a shadow through the sleeping city. Horses, soldiers, porters, and Tlaxcalans, their footsteps muffled against the stone. They reached the first causeway. The wooden bridge was set in place, and the column began to cross. For a moment, it seemed the plan might work. Then came the crishrill, piercing and echoing across the lake. A watchman had spotted them. Within moments, drums thundered from the Templo Mayor, calling the warriors to arms. Canoes shot out from the darkness, arrows and spears slicing through the air. From the far shore, Aztec warriors charged onto the causeway, their obsidian blades glinting in the moonlight. Chaos on the causeway. Panic exploded in the Spanish ranks. Men slipped on the wet stone, falling into the lake's black water, dragged down by the weight of stolen gold. The portable bridge became clogged with bodies. Horses reared and plunged into the water, their riders dragged under. The Aztecs fought with fury. Canoes rammed the causeway, warriors leaping aboard to strike at the fleeing soldiers. Muskets roared, but the night swallowed the sound, and for every enemy felled, another took his place. Bernal del Castillo would later write of screams, splashing, the unending drumbeat from the city, a sound that seemed to mark the Spaniards' doom. The cost of survival. By dawn, the survivors staggered onto the mainland. Of the roughly 1,300 Spaniards and allies who had begun the escape, nearly half were dead. The Tlaxcalans had suffered terribly. Treasure lay scattered on the lake bed, glinting faintly beneath the rippling surface. His armor, soaked and face drawn, sat beneath a tree, staring back at the distant city. This moment, remembered as La Noche Triste, the night of sorrows, was burned into his soul. He had tasted the edge of defeat, and it was bitter. But Cortés was not a man who surrendered. Even as he mourned his losses, he was already thinking of revenge. The summer of 1521 dawned hot and heavy over the Valley of Mexico. 2 years had passed since first set foot on the causeways of when that time he had tasted both the heights of triumph and the depths of defeat. The memory of La Noche Triste still burned in his minder wound to both pride and ambition. Now, he returned not as a desperate fugitive, but as the commander of a war machine. A new army, Cortés, had spent months rebuilding his strength. He rallied his Tlaxcalan allies, whose hatred of Aztec rule burned hotter than ever. Warriors from other tributary states, eager to see the empire fall, joined the cause. By the time the campaign began, commanded over Barshawu, 0 indigenous warriors alongside fewer than 1,000 Spaniards, but those Spaniards had steel, muskets, cannons, and war horses. Most crucial of all, had constructed 13 brigantine small, fast warships designed to dominate Lake Tex. These ships were built in Tlaxcala, carried in pieces across the mountains, and reassembled on the lake's shore, a feat of engineering and determination that stunned his allies. The plan, the strategy, was ruthless and precise. Cut the causeways to isolate from the mainland, use the brigantines to control the lake and sever the city's supply lines, advance along all 3 causeways from the north, west, and south, squeezing the city in a tightening noose. Understood that this would not be a swift battle. The Aztecs were fierce defenders, and their city was a fortress surrounded by water. The Aztec resolve, in the new emperor, rose to power after Moctezuma's death and the brief, doomed reign of his successor. Young, determined, and unyielding, vowed to defend the city to the last breath. He commanded his warriors to prepare every street, every rooftop, every canal for battle. The Aztecs rebuilt barricades, readied their canoes, and stockpiled weapons. Every able-bodied man, woman, and child would play a role, whether carrying stones to the front lines or ferrying food to the fighters. The siege begins in May 1521. The attack began. The brigantines swept across Lake Texcoco, their sails catching the wind, cannons booming as they smashed Aztec canoes. Along the causeways, Spanish soldiers advanced behind shields, their indigenous allies swarming ahead to fill in gaps and push back defenders. The Aztecs struck with cunning. They lured Spanish forces deep into the city, then cut the causeway behind them, trapping the enemy in deadly ambushes. Canoes attacked from the canals, warriors leapt from rooftops, and the air filled with the hiss of obsidian-tipped arrows. Hunger and disease. As the weeks dragged on, the siege turned into a war of attrition. Spanish brigantines intercepted every canoe carrying food or water into the city. Crops on the Chinampas were burned. The once bustling markets of Tlatelolco fell silent. Worse still, smallpox brought unknowingly by the Spaniards ravaged the population. Entire families died in their homes, their bodies left unburied. The disease cut down warriors and civilians alike, weakening the city's ability to resist. The city in ruins by July, Tenochtitlan was unrecognizable. The white temples and palaces were pitted with cannon fire, the canals choked with wreckage and corpses. Hunger gnawed at the survivors. Water from the lake was brackish and foul. Those who drank it fell ill, yet refused to surrender. Every street was contested, every block fought over at the cost of dozens of lives. The Spaniards advanced yard by yard, leaving behind only rubble and blood. The final stand in mid-August. The siege entered its final days. The Spanish forces had pushed the defenders into the northern district of Tlatelolco. Here, surrounded and outnumbered, made his last stand. His warriors fought with the desperation of men defending not just their homes, but the very soul of their people. On August 13, 1521, attempted to flee across the lake in a canoe. A Spanish brigantine intercepted him. Brought before the young emperor, is said to have spoken with unbroken dignity. "I have done all I could to defend my people. Now, take the dagger in your belt and kill me." Cortés refused to kill him, but spared him only to witness the destruction of his city. The fall of an empire when the fighting ended was a skeleton of its former glory. Its temples burned, its streets littered with the dead, its canals filled with the stench of decay. What had once been the jewel of the lake was now a graveyard. The Aztec Empire was no more. In its place, the viceroyalty of New Spain would rise under the Spanish crown. But for those who had walked its streets, heard the drums of the Templo Mayor, and danced in the festivals of the gods, the memory of would never die. It would live in stories, in ruins, and in the whispered name of the last great city of the Mexica. The smoke of its ruins had barely settled, when the last Tlatoani of the Mexica was led in chains through what remained of his city. The streets, where once the market of Tlatelolco bustled with life, were now filled with silence and ash. The grand causeways that had carried warriors in triumph now bore the weight of defeat, yet walked with his head high. His eyes met those of the survivors, emaciated, broken, but still proud, and in that moment, he was not a prisoner. He was their last warrior, the final embodiment of the Mexica spirit. The fate of the last emperor kept alive, perhaps out of respect, perhaps because he saw value in controlling a symbol. For years, the young emperor was forced to accompany Spanish campaigns. His presence used to pacify the remaining pockets of resistance. In 1525, during an expedition to Honduras, accused of plotting rebellion, the truth of the charge remains lost to history, but the verdict was swift. The last ruler of the Aztec Empire was hanged without ceremony, his body left to swing in the humid jungle air. The eagle had fallen. The aftermath: with the fall of the Aztec capital, the Spanish began rebuilding as Mexico City, the heart of the viceroyalty of New Spain. The stones of the Templo Mayor were torn down to build cathedrals and palaces. Canals were filled, lakes drained, and European streets cut through what had once been a city of water. Yet the Mexica people did not vanish. Survivors carried their traditions in songs, stories, and the Nahuatl language. Some served as laborers in the new colonial system. Others fled to the countryside, away from Spanish eyes, where their culture endured in hidden villages. The survival of memory. For centuries, the story of the Aztec Empire was told mostly through Spanish eyes histories written by conquerors, chroniclers, and priests. Yet in the quiet of indigenous households, the old stories persisted. The prophecy of the eagle and cactus, the glory of the Triple Alliance, the beauty of the floating gardens, the courage of... Through these stories, the spirit of the Mexica lived on, defying the centuries. The legacy today, modern Mexico still carries the imprint of the Aztecs, the eagle perched on a cactus, devouring a serpent. The very vision that led the Mexica to found their city now sits at the center of the Mexican flag. The ruins of the Templo Mayor stand beside colonial churches, a reminder that history is never erased, only layered. Nahuatl words fill the Spanish spoken in Mexico, and ancient festivals blend with Catholic saints' days in a cultural tapestry woven from both conquest and resilience. The eternal city is gone, its temples submerged in time, its canals replaced by streets. But in the memory of the people, it is still their city that rose from a swamp to become the greatest jewel of the Americas, a city whose fall marked the end of one world and the birth of another. And as long as the story of the Mexica is told around fires, in classrooms, in the hearts of those who walk the streets of Mexico City, the last eagle still soars.